The lawyer looked at me across the desk and said, "Legally, you were never married. I had a daughter with this man for years of my life, and apparently none of it was real. But let me take you back to the Tuesday morning when everything started to fall apart, because that is where this story actually begins." It was an ordinary morning. Mia was in her high chair, I was on my second coffee, and Daniel had already left for work. I wasn't thinking about anything heavier than what to make for dinner that night. And then someone knocked on my front door and I opened it, and there was a woman standing on my porch that I had never seen before in my life. She was calm in a way that felt rehearsed, like she had played this moment out in her head so many times that she had gone past the fear and landed somewhere very still on the other side. She looked at me, then at Mia on my hip, and she said, "Are you Sarah?" "I'm Caroline. I'm married to your husband." I remember Mia grabbing at my collar. I remember the coffee still warm in my hand. I remember a car passing on the street behind her, completely normal, the world entirely indifferent to what had just been said on my doorstep. And I remember my brain hearing the words clearly but refusing to connect them into anything that made sense. Like a sentence in a language I almost spoke but not quite. I asked her to say it again. She did. Same words. Same calm voice. And then she took out her phone and turned the screen toward me and showed me a photograph. A wedding photo. Caroline in a white dress standing next to my husband, in a church I had never seen, surrounded by people I had never met. And the date on that photo, she showed me by tapping the screen slowly, deliberately, like she wanted to make sure I saw it. That date was 4 years before Daniel ever walked into my life. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that Mia started fussing and pulling my hair. I shifted her to my other hip. I looked at Caroline, and I said, "Come in." I still don't completely understand why I said that. I think part of me knew that if I closed the door I would have to stand alone in that kitchen with what she had just told me, and that felt unbearable. Having her inside, having another body in the room, was the only thing that felt manageable in that moment. So we sat down at my kitchen table. Mia went on the floor with her toys, and Caroline began to talk. But before I tell you what she said, I need to tell you how I got here, because this story didn't start on a Tuesday morning. It started 3.5 years earlier at a work event I almost didn't go to. I was 31, working in marketing for a mid-sized company, and a colleague had convinced me to come to a professional networking evening that I had zero interest in attending. I walked in, grabbed a drink, stood at the side of the room looking for the earliest polite moment to leave, and then a man started talking to me. His name was Daniel. He worked in logistics consulting, he was easy to talk to, and he had this quality that I now understand was extremely carefully constructed but at the time just felt genuine. He made you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. We talked for 2 hours. I forgot to look for the exit. We dated for just over a year. He was consistent and attentive and present in all the ways that matter when you're deciding whether someone is real. He proposed on a quiet weekend away. No big gesture, no performance, just a simple question asked sincerely over dinner. I said yes without hesitating. The wedding was small by design. Neither of us wanted anything elaborate. City Hall dinner with close friends, simple and ours. Daniel offered to handle the legal paperwork because he had a contact, a friend in family law, he said, who could make the process easier and cheaper than going through the standard bureaucratic channels. I didn't question it. He put documents in front of me and I signed them and I was happy and I trusted him completely, and it never once crossed my mind that there was anything inside those papers worth looking for. Mia came 11 months later. And for 3 years after that, I lived the life I believed I had chosen. It was imperfect and exhausting in the way that life with a toddler always is, but it was full of noise and routine and small moments that felt like they were building toward something. Daniel was a present father, genuinely, visibly involved. That detail still sits in a strange place in my mind, because I have spent a lot of time since then trying to understand how a man can be that tender with his child while maintaining a lie so complete and so carefully managed that the woman raising his daughter had absolutely no idea it was there. About 6 months before that Tuesday, something shifted. Nothing I could name or point to directly, just a texture of distance that hadn't been there before. A phone always face down on the table. Work trips that came slightly more frequently than before. A way of answering ordinary questions with just a little too much casual detail, like the answer had already been prepared before I finished asking. I noticed. I filed it away. I told myself I was tired and anxious and reading into things that weren't there, because after 4 years with someone, after a child and a home and a shared life, you give them the benefit of every doubt you have. You trust what you built. And then Caroline sat down at my kitchen table and started to tell me who my husband actually was. Caroline and Daniel had been married for 7 years. They had 2 sons, 6 and 4 years old. She lived 35 minutes away from me, in a town I had driven through multiple times without ever knowing that my husband had another address there, another bedroom, another kitchen where another woman made his coffee in the morning. She found out about me 4 months before she knocked on my door. A mutual acquaintance, someone who had grown up in Daniel's hometown and had recently moved closer to my area, had seen a photo of Daniel and me together at a family event that a friend had posted publicly. This person knew Caroline, knew her well enough to feel that she deserved to know, and so they told her. Caroline said she spent those 4 months trying to decide what to do with what she knew. She contacted a lawyer immediately, she gathered everything she needed, and then she spent weeks going back and forth about whether to come to me directly, or to simply let the legal process play out without involving me personally. She said what finally made her decide to come was this. She had 2 children with this man, I had a child with this man, and she felt that I deserved to hear it from a person and not from a document. I appreciated that. I told her so, right there at my kitchen table, which felt like a strange thing to be saying, but I meant it. Daniel's system, as Caroline explained it and as I later came to understand it more fully, was built on geography and scheduling. He had structured his working week so that his travel and his consulting work, which was real, he did actually work, which somehow made it worse, gave him a natural cover for splitting his time. Roughly half the week with her and the boys. Roughly half with me and Mia. Clean enough that neither household ever felt abandoned. Present enough that neither of us had serious cause for alarm. He had been doing this for 3 years. The entire length of what I thought was my marriage. The legal situation was what Caroline had come to explain to me most urgently, because she had already been through it with her lawyer, and she wanted me to understand my position before I heard it from someone else or figured it out in the worst possible way. Her marriage was legal, registered correctly, filed properly, completely valid. Mine was not. The paperwork that Daniel's so-called lawyer friend had handled, the documents I had signed without reading carefully enough, had not been properly filed with the county. Whether that was a deliberate decision on Daniel's part to protect himself legally, or whether it was a more complicated arrangement between him and whoever helped him, was something that would eventually come out. But the result was straightforward and brutal. There was no legal record of my marriage. The certificate I had framed on the bedroom wall was not worth the paper it was printed on. I sat across from Caroline and I felt the floor simply disappear. I called a lawyer myself that afternoon, while Caroline sat in my living room and Mia napped. The lawyer confirmed everything Caroline had told me within 20 minutes of looking at what I could send him digitally. He said we would need to meet in person to go through my options, but the basic facts were not complicated. I had no legal standing as a spouse. I had full standing as a mother, which he said immediately and clearly, and I held on to that like it was the only solid thing left in the room. When Daniel came home that evening, Caroline was still there. I had asked her to stay and she had said yes without hesitating. He walked through the front door, set his bag down, and then he saw her. And his face did something I had never seen it do in 4 years, it just collapsed. Not for long. A second, maybe 2. Then he pulled it back and tried to arrange himself into something that looked like composure. But both Caroline and I had seen it, and all 3 of us knew that there was no version of the next conversation that he was walking out of intact. I told him to sit down. He started to speak and I told him to stop. I told him I was not ready to hear his voice explaining things to me right now because I did not trust what would happen in my body if he started talking, and I needed to get through the next few minutes without falling apart. So I told him what I knew. I told him I had spoken to a lawyer. I told him I understood my legal position and Mia's legal position, and I told him that I had already started making calls. And then I told him the one thing I needed him to hear clearly above everything else. I told him to get his things and leave my house. He looked at Mia's toys scattered across the living room floor, and his eyes filled up and he started to cry. Actual tears, real ones, and I watched them and felt nothing. I want to be honest about that because I expected to feel something, grief or rage or even some terrible complicated relief. But I just felt a profound and total exhaustion. Like every feeling had already been used up somewhere in the previous 8 hours, and there was simply nothing left to run on. He left that night. Caroline left shortly after. We exchanged numbers at the door. She hugged me, briefly, and I let her. And neither of us said anything because there was nothing to say that covered it. We were two women standing in a hallway trying to work out how to carry something that neither of us had asked to pick up. The hardest moment of the entire day did not happen when Caroline showed me the photograph. It did not happen when the lawyer confirmed my marriage was invalid. It did not happen when Daniel cried on his way out the door. It happened the next morning. Mia woke up at her usual time, padded into the kitchen in her pajamas with the little elephants on them, climbed up into her chair, and looked around the room with those completely open 3-year-old eyes that take in everything without filter or pretense. And she said, "Where's Daddy?" Just like that. Simple. Certain that the answer was somewhere close and easy. I picked her up and held her, and I pressed my face into her hair for a moment before I answered. And then I said, "Daddy's not here right now, baby. But you're going to see him." Because that part one had already decided, alone in my room the night before while I couldn't sleep. Whatever Daniel had done to me, Mia was not going to lose her father. That was a separate and complicated conversation. One that was going to take time and involve lawyers and careful choices about words and timing. But she was not going to lose him. That was her right, not mine to take away. She seemed satisfied with the answer. She asked for her cereal. I made it. That afternoon I packed 2 bags, one for me, one for her. I called my sister and said we were coming, and she said okay, come now, and didn't ask me to explain everything on the phone. I loaded Mia into her car seat and she asked where we were going, and I said we were going to Aunt Meg's because Aunt Meg had that dog she liked. She said, "The big fluffy one?" I said yes, the big fluffy one. She said okay and looked out the window and started humming something quietly to herself. Some song from a cartoon, easy and uncomplicated and entirely her own. I pulled out of the driveway. I did not look back at the house. I had no idea what the next months were going to look like. I had no idea how to explain any of this to a 3-year-old in words she could hold. I had no idea how long it would take to feel like a person again instead of someone standing inside the wreckage of a life that turned out to be built on nothing real. But I had Mia humming in the back seat. And I had my sister's voice on the phone saying come now. And I had the road in front of me going somewhere that was not here. And that was enough to keep driving.